This is part 5 in a series of videos in which I'm attempting to repair this MADAS 9E mechanical calculator. In the previous videos I got as far as getting the division to kind of work, and I replaced the missing circlip and tried to figure out why the mechanism wouldn't stay into the mode it was put in. Figured that one out. There's just some sticking levers, and spring was in the wrong place, circlip was missing, so I've got that sorted out, but it still won't do division properly. It will go into division mode, but then it just cycles around indefinitely, subtracting the number that's set in the lower section of the machine. The number is successfully subtracted from the main number, but it never performs a carry, or at least it never moves the carriage along, and it requires the carriage to move along to ultimately complete the division cycle. So looking around, I was trying to figure out what was going on, and I noticed that despite the fact that the number was being continuously subtracted, beyond a certain point on the main number, the carry or the borrow was not being propagated. So in other words, the number was kind of frozen. Although they're all free to rotate, it wasn't updating properly towards the end of the carriage. And because the carriage advance is actuated by one of the carry levers, notice that particular carry lever was never moving. And so I've turned the machine, as you can see, so we can see underneath it. And looking at the carry mechanism, so all the shafts you can see here are for the carry levers, and these little levers here that slide up and down on these detent springs are the carry or borrow levers, and they're responsible for borrowing a value, a digit from the following column, or for carrying one across. And what I've noticed is that this particular one is just moving around freely on its shaft. All the rest are captive. There's a little post that they sit on, so this hole here. On all the others, there's a little post on this cam that they ride on, and these little detent springs allow them to move up or down depending on whether a carry or a borrow is required. I noticed they were all down, so in other words, it was expecting to do a carry or a borrow from all of the digits beyond this one that's flopping around. So I suspect it's not successfully propagating the carry and the borrow, which is why it's never moving on to progress the carriage to the next position. So looking at this a bit more closely, and it is possible, of course, that this is the way it's meant to be and that the carriage is split in two, but I somehow doubt it, because there's no way to actually get a carry or a borrow to propagate past this point. So looking at this, I also noticed that if you rotate the cam round, I can see the remnants of what appears to be one of these posts. On this one there's a kind of a post that extends down that the cam slides up and down on, and it's either pressed or threaded into the body of the cam. And on this one I can see there's something in what would have been the hole there, but there's nothing underneath, so it looks like it's snapped off flush, and this may well be as a result of the mechanism having jammed during a carry, and it just sheared off. There's nothing inside the case that I can see. I'd look in there, should be a small piece left, but with no way of knowing when this happened or what's been done to this machine ever since. So unfortunately, it means I've got to take the front cover off the machine, so I've got to take this entire front section off with all the gears and get this out so I can repair it and put a new shaft in. So I have to machine one and figure out what size it should be, and drill out the old one and re-tap it, and hopefully that will get the machine working. But first thing I need to do is get this front cover off. Okay, so I've removed the front drive system. These are all the gears that translate drive across the machine. Wasn't too difficult to get off. and that's enabled me to lift out the offending carry cam and shaft. So to get this out, once I'd taken the front cover off, and I was very careful as I took it off that all these didn't follow it off. I didn't want them dropping out all over the bench. And once I've got the front cover off, I could slide this out from the cam. The cam is still captive. There's a detent spring down here that holds it in position if a carriage is required, and there's a second one further down underneath that sits behind the carriage and is actuated by the carry levers that the carriage operates on. And that's what's not what isn't working. It's not operating on this particular carry shaft, and I think that's why the division isn't working. It's not successfully actuating the carry lever, and part of that is linked to the carriage advance, and that's not happening. And so I think it's just a case of this one isn't being actuated. So looking in the hole for this, this is kind of where I suspect there should be a shaft protruding through here, and although it looks like there's a hole drilled, there is a hole in there, but looking in there it looks like the shaft is snapped off. It's kind of a rough, kind of jagged look, dull grey look that you get when you snap a piece of brittle metal. And it doesn't look like a drilled hole in there. It looks like, as I say, a piece is sheared off or broken off, and that would explain why it's not working. I don't want to take the cam out. There's no need to at this point. I just need to replace this pin that sits in this cam, and the only way I can get this cam out is to remove the carriage and the carry lever system, which is quite a major task, and I don't want to do that if I don't need to. And there's no need to, because this will slide out, and in theory once I've replaced the shaft I can slide it back in and then reassemble everything. One thing I have found while poking about under here that was of interest, I'll just zoom the camera in so you can see. I've been saying that I thought this was a Model 9, and it's upside down at the moment, so bear that in mind. But down here are the digits IX, so Roman numerals for 9, and so I think this is indeed the Model 9. They are designated in Roman numerals by the manufacturer anyway, so it does seem to confirm that this is a Model 9. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll get over to the workshop, make a replacement shaft for this, and get it reassembled and see if that gets division working. Okay, so I've repaired this carry shaft and cam. I drilled out the broken part of the old stub, turned a new shaft from silver steel. I made it a press fit in the cam, made it the same length as the other ones. I couldn't find any trace of the original part, so I assume it's the same length. These all look the same, and this carry cam looks identical to the rest. So if I've done this right, then this cam should ride up and down on this under control of the detent spring. So what I'll do is zoom you in so you can see the cam more clearly, and then we'll try fitting this and see if it works. Okay, so the shaft should fit down into the center of the cam, and the small stub should fit into this hole, and if we pull the detent spring back we should be able to pull the cam all the way up, which we can, so that's looking quite promising, and it should slide up and down quite freely, which it does. So as we can see, it goes all the way to the top and down under control of the detent spring, so it's nice and free, it's not binding or catching, and the pin is in the right place. So as you can see, the cam still engages with the follower there, so there's no big issue. If you get the pin in the wrong place, of course, then this won't engage. And as you can see, it's quite nice and free to slide up and down, so I don't think we should have any issues with it. So next thing to do is get the front gear cover back on, and we can give the machine another try. Okay, so I've refitted this carry shaft and cam and the repair seems to have worked quite successfully. It's nice and free to move, and I started refitting this front panel, and one of the issues I had, apart from the broken peg on this cam, was that when I was trying to run division previously, the machine would jam up, and I assume that was just because this cam arm was out of step with all the rest. The way these work is the operation you're carrying out kind of ripples through the machine, so each of these stages is slightly out of step with the previous one, so each one runs effectively one gear tooth behind the previous one, and it causes operations to ripple through the entire machine. The only complication is that from this point on, where the broken one was, these gears on the underside, so obviously you've got gears on the underside of here that mesh with these gears on top, are much smaller. So from this follower on, the last 6 run much faster than the first one, so the timing's slightly different. You can kind of see how the timing suddenly changes for these arms. And I noticed that all these were out, so apart from this one being broken, the rest weren't in the correct locations, and they can't move on their own because the gears are pinned to the shaft, and it's a single shaft, so you can't easily adjust them independently. When you take this front plate off, when you refit it, you time everything so that it's working, and you have to time that also with the carry cams that sit behind. So, and you also have to time the first barrel so that it is in the correct orientation relative to the rest of the machine. So when I refitted this, I retimed all this, and that cleared up the second problem of it not properly borrowing digits across the machine when I did a subtraction. So the easiest way to test this is to set the top number for 0, set a 1 on the lower number, set the machine to subtract, and then cycle it once, and you should get an underflow, so it should read 9s all the way across if it's working. So that was then working fine, so that cleared up the problem. It's still added fine, but I still have a problem when I come to do division. I'll turn the machine the right way up so you can see what the problem is, or at least I'll try to explain what the problem is, but it's a bit difficult to explain. I'll zoom the camera back in so we can see the part of the mechanism that's causing the issue. Okay, I don't know how clear this will be on the camera, but the way the machine operates is in normal mode like this, then it just runs through single cycles and adds or subtracts. When you pull this lever across to put it into the divide mode, it does several things. Firstly, it moves this arm across, and it brings the back end of it, this end, in line with one of these levers. Now these levers are responsible for setting the carry or borrow arms on the cams, and when you put it into divide, then it lines this end of this lever up with this one. And what happens then is when the borrow effectively, or underflow, ripples through the machine, it operates this arm, and that's what's supposed to prompt the machine to either move to the next column, or if it's at column 0, the home column, then it should terminate the operation. Now it's successfully moving columns. When it underflows a particular digit, then it will cause the machine to move to the next column and repeat the process. And when it gets to the end, it's supposed to stop the process, and that's where it's failing. And I think the reason it's failing is, firstly, the timing was way out. There's another gear down here, and I think basically the machine's been apart. Somebody was attempting to repair the broken pin that I replaced, and I think when it was put together, I've got a feeling they gave up and just put it back together however it was. So there's a few issues. Firstly, this gear down here, you probably can't see it, but it's responsible for moving or causing the carriage to be incremented and moved along, and it's also responsible for operating the cam that terminates the division. If if you recall, there's an arm that comes up through a slot here. It's captured by this lever. Very hard to see, but there's a lever down here that captures that arm, holds it in the divide mode, and what's supposed to happen, it should stay in divide up until the point where the carriage comes to the end, hits this arm, moves it across, and then that allows the cam that runs on this gear to cause it to terminate the process by pushing this up, the same as if the cancel division button had been pressed. And the problem is it's not working properly. When the carriage comes to the home position, it is moving this, but it's not moving it anywhere near far enough to engage the cam with this part of the lever, so it's not pushing this up. And I think that the problem is just wear. I think that's why this spring was moved. Someone was trying to get around the problem. So you can see there's a lot of slack in this, and all that's happening is when the pin comes across to operate this, it's really just taking up the slack, and it's not actually making it move. Also, I think that on the carriage, this hole here where my thumb is just had a screw poking through, and it was just a small countersunk screw. Let's see if we can find it. Okay, so it just had this screw poking through, and I don't think that's what should be there. So this is it was screwed through this hole from the front, but it's I think it's too small a diameter. I think it's too long. You can see there's a kind of a witness mark here where the end of that screw has been hitting this rivet, and so I think it's too long. I also think it should be something larger in diameter to push this further. A very long slot in this, and it seems pointless having such a long slot and such a small amount of movement. Let's take this out of the way so I can demonstrate it more easily. So it should slide across like this, and it's barely moving, so it should go from approximately there to around there, and this end is not moving at all. Top end's moving about a millimetre, but it's not enough. Now it could be that the carriage is not moving to the correct position because it's incorrectly adjusted, but I've had a look at that and it seems to be going to the right location, and it has to go into a fairly well defined location so that it properly engages with the transfer gears, and that seems right. So I think the carriage is in the right place. I think the problem is down here. Now most likely it's in this plate, so all this wear I think is just preventing this end of the plate from moving correctly. So what I'm going to do is take this plate off, have a look at it, and I'll either have to remake this plate or possibly make some new screws or bushings up that reduce this clearance so that it gives us much better defined movement of this control arm. While I'm at it, I'll also take this arm off. The end of it's really galled up. I think someone's been it looks like this at some point got damaged and someone tried to flatten it with a hammer, because there's a lot of dents and impact marks on this. I think this has had quite a colourful history, but I'll take it out, we'll have a closer look at it and see if we can figure out the best way to repair it and get it working. Okay, so I've removed the top actuator plate, and this is the slot I mentioned previously of being misformed. It's supposed to be a clean slot, but it's got some detents worn in it, which is I think causing the mechanism to stick slightly. I don't think that's the main cause of the problem now. I've also taken out the lower arm, and this is what I was talking about, where it's been fairly badly galled up. It's probably quite hard to see on camera, but it's got some fairly severe bruising and galling on the end, so I'll need to clean that up. The rest of it doesn't look too bad. It's fairly straight, needs de-rusting, but other than that seems to be in fairly good condition. The rest of the mechanism seems to be fairly free. It's nothing sticking or bent or binding. It all seems to be operating the way that it should. I've taken off the bell ringer actuator arm, but this is I think where we have the main problem, and again it's probably quite difficult to see on camera, but this is fairly badly distorted, so I've got a feeling at some point this got caught up or bent or damaged and someone's just simply hammered it flat. You can see possibly a lot of hammer marks in it, so I think that's part of the problem. It's also bent, there's a distinct curve in it, but I think the main issue really is this slot is too wide. So we're getting 3.5 millimeters, 3.6, 3.4, but when we look at the screws that sit in that slot, the boss on them is only 3.3 millimeters. So it doesn't sound like a great deal, but that's easily enough to cause this to rock about too much, and it's just not transferring the motion in the way it's supposed to. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go over to the workshop. I may be able to close this gap up. I think it's just bowed out in the middle, so when it was hammered back flat, I think what's happened is that the hammering action has caused it to curve and for these bits to splay out. So as I say, I'll take it to the workshop, try and get this sorted out. I'm also looking at the marks on here, and I believe what we need to do is replace that small screw that was in here with a small boss, something with a slightly bigger diameter that will push this further when it gets into its home position. I also need to close up this end. It's splayed out, and it's a very loose fit on this end, and again that allows it to move freely rather than being in a fairly well defined position. Okay, so I'll go and do this, and I'll clean up the other two levers while I'm at it, and then we'll have a go at refitting it and see if it improves things at all. Okay, so back from the workshop, what I've done is I've reground the end of this. The important part of this is this face here. It's angled at about 35 degrees, and this is the lever that captures the arm that pops up when we put the machine into division mode, and this lever holds it in place and until this lever moves across to release it. So I've reground that. Still looks a bit rough, but I don't want to replace it unless I really need to. Cleaned up the rest. The rest isn't too bad, and I've also tidied up and cleaned the actuator lever. Now we're definitely not the first to try and repair this machine. It looks like the previous attempt favourite tool was a hammer, so it's like someone's just been sort of randomly beating on these parts with the hammer, and it's probably not really the best route to success with these machines. So I've tidied that up as best I can. I might have to do a bit more work around this slot if it sticks. But the main thing was this lever. It was fairly badly distorted, and again it had been beaten fairly severely with a hammer. You can see now that I've cleaned it, all the dents and dings where someone's just been randomly beating it for some apparent reason, possibly trying to close up the gap, but that's not really the way to do it. I have now closed up the gap properly. I closed it up and then filed it back out so it was the right size, and I was aiming for about 3.25 millimeters, so not too far out, and that now gives us quite a nice tight fit with the screws. So the idea is to make the screws a fairly nice sliding fit, but we don't want them to be tight in the slot. So I'll get these parts refitted to the machine and we'll see if we're getting any nearer. Okay, so I've refitted the levers and they all went back in without any problems, and the idea now is that this slide should move when it's hit by the carriage, and the motion up at this point should be transferred down here. So as you can see, it's quite nice and free to slide, but it's not now rocking about. So if I try to move it back and forth, you can see that this point here isn't moving, whereas when I press on here it is sliding across. So in other words, any motion here imparted by the end stop on the carriage is going to be transferred successfully down to the cam down at this point here. Now I don't know the timing of this cam yet. I need to figure that out. This was just loose like this and wasn't engaged with the gear, so I think I've got the timing right now for the main gear, but I need to figure out at what point this cam should be pressing this up. So next thing is I'll refit the carriage, and we'll try a division and see if we can figure out what this cam should be timed to. Okay, so a bit of tinkering later, and I think making some progress. I was trying to figure out the timing for this gear and cam, and this is responsible for the final cancellation of the division function. But because all this had been taken out at some point and was just loose when I got it, I didn't know quite what the timing should be. So to figure this out, I put it into division mode, held the division cancel button down, and then just manually rotated the calculator, and at the point where the division cancelled, that's the point where I set the cam, so it was effectively doing the same thing that the button was doing at that point in the cycle. That seems to have got the division working up to a certain point. I'll just give a quick demonstration before I finish this video, and in the next video we'll look at doing some tidy up and some more testing. But the carriage now slides very freely. I did some more work freeing this up. It was binding, and I've now got that working nice and freely. On this assembly I did find another issue. It's quite difficult to explain, but the lever down on the side cheek here that captures this plate that is responsible for holding the machine in division mode wasn't really coming up high enough, and in profile it looks a bit like a swan's head in profile. Imagine that the underside of the beak catches on top of this plate and kind of holds, this plate holds it up, and then at the end of the function this plate moves up and it releases that lever, drops down, and then the calculation is finished. But it wasn't coming up high enough for the beak part to clear this plate, so it wasn't properly engaging and wasn't reliably holding on to it. So I took it off and looked at it, and it looked like at some point it had been bent, so the swan was kind of looking up into the sky. So I straightened the neck out, put it back on, and now it captures that plate reliably. The rest of it seems to be working fine. This plate, as I said, now moves nice and freely, and it doesn't have any appreciable slack in it, so any movement up at the top is directly translated down to the cam area where it's needed. That's its only function, so if it's not doing that, then there's no point it being there. I also had to adjust this stop. It was too far back, so it wasn't allowing this plate to pivot down far enough in the first place. So now I've done that, we can give it a test. I'll put it into the last but one location for the carriage, and what I'll do now is I'll set a value of 10 on the lower number. You can't see it, it's on the right hand side of the machine, and I'll set a value of 1000 on the upper. That's actually dividing 100 by 10, not 1000 by 10, because we've got the carriage moved across one location. This is how you do decimal places on a machine like this. The intermediate number is cleared, so I'll now make sure we're in divide mode, which we are, and I'll start rotating the machine. Still in motor footage, I'll do this manually, and one of the things you notice with machines like this as you start to make progress is they turn more and more freely, and now I can barely feel the mechanism doing anything. In fact, when I first did this I thought it wasn't working, but it is counting down. So far it's subtracted 10 from the 100.0 twice, so the intermediate value is showing 20, the top number is showing 800, which is 80. I'll rotate it again down to 700, 600, and the intermediate count is incrementing each time round. That's going to be our result. So we're down to 400, 300. When it gets to 0 it should overflow and cause the carriage to move on, in this case to the final column. So we're down to 100, we're now on 0, and it's now overflowing, so this should cause the machine to move the carriage along and now cancel the division, which it has done. So that's worked. We've got the correct value in the intermediate field. The top number is showing as 0. That cancels once the overflow is finished and the division cancels. And it's exited the division function, so that seems to be working. I don't know if this is all correctly configured. The other thing I did is make sure that the numbers that are on this wheel, this indicator wheel, there's only 3 numbers. It's either 0, 1 or 2. I think that's a mode that it's running in, and they're not evenly spaced, so what I've done is fine-tune the position of the gear to make it so that one of the numbers always shows through what would be the aperture on the front panel, and that's in theory I think it would be a unique position because of the way they're spaced. I think there's only one position on the gears when you have these 2 gears correctly aligned that will allow it to do that. The cancel division also works. I think there's supposed to be a knob on this that holds it up through the front panel, so I'll probably have to make something up for that, and also fit another spring for the end of cycle bell, and obviously clean up the bell and refit and test that. So we'll move on to some more in-depth testing in the next video, but certainly made some progress in this one. The main issues seem to be the amount of wear that was in this transfer plate, and also the swan's neck, the gooseneck, wasn't coming up high enough. Got all the columns realigned so that it properly propagates the carry or borrow across the entire machine, and I can now fit the remaining screws to the gear plate, and from that point on I'm hoping it's just onto the final drive and clean up. But famous last words.